Now, the next speaker is Mr. Craig Davies. Craig, would you like to answer the questions? And we would really welcome your recommendations for concrete actions that we could take up.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Benedictus. I'm afraid that I don't have any slides, so you'll just have to listen to me instead. I think firstly I'd like to start by thanking the organisers for this week's forum, which I think has been extremely interesting. And I also note that the Standing Committee on Finance is an interesting grouping. There's a very varied mix of countries on the Standing Committee for Finance. Of course, we have developing countries and developed countries, but we also have representation from the different parts of the world. So we always see interesting discussions within the SCF for that very reason. But I think what's been great about this forum is that the circle has been widened even further. And we've brought in perspectives from other communities. We've had the private sector represented here. We've had ratings agencies represented. We've had groupings from the investment community represented. We've had industry associations working on sectors like hydropower and ports. And I think that's added even more diversity into the discussions. And I think it's really added to some very interesting discussions over the last 2 days. I think I'll start by just giving some impressions of some of the things that I think I've learned over the last 2 days, which have leapt out at me from the discussions. I think one impression that I've had is that it's reinforced the really strong link between infrastructure and human development. And in the context of climate resilience, the link between climate resilient infrastructure and climate resilient human development. And we've heard all kinds of really interesting examples of how, for example, better water supplies can contribute towards human development, can contribute towards better human health, can contribute towards better living standards. We've heard about how better energy supplies can ensure that people have better access to heating, have better access to lighting in their homes, which is important for a whole range of human development factors, such as education and health. We've heard about transport, roads and ports, and we've heard about how that kind of infrastructure is so important for enabling better access to public services, for connecting producers to their markets, and how they're so very important for livelihoods. So here in Morocco, for example, with a big agricultural sector, the transport infrastructure is so important for enabling farmers to get their produce to the markets. So it's really reinforced the idea that climate resilient infrastructure contributes towards climate resilient human development. It's not a zero-sum decision whether it's infrastructure or human development. Infrastructure is very much part of how we can make human development more climate resilient. The second impression I've got is that we've entered into a new historic period with the Paris Agreement, which is a tremendous achievement. And we now have a global framework for coordinated action on climate change, both at the international and at the national level. And one issue that's stood out for me from the discussions is this question of strategic planning. And how can we have strategic planning that can support the mobilization of finance for climate resilient infrastructure? I think we have a great opportunity now with the Paris Agreement and with the NDCs to start using that framework as a way of coordinating action on working out the best ways to mobilize finance for climate resilient action, including infrastructure. So that's also something that I think stands out as an opportunity, but also a challenge, because we've also heard that there's a lot more work to be done in supporting countries around the world in developing these strategic planning frameworks consistent with the Paris Agreement, consistent with NDCs, that can then lead to the more efficient mobilization of financial resources. And the last impression is that there's a very strong trend at the moment, a lot of attention on the question of emerging metrics and standards. And this is a very interesting and important development, I think, in the climate resilience debate. There's an old mantra, or maybe it's an old cliche, which is that if you can measure something, you can manage it. And I think we're now entering a very interesting new phase in the climate resilience debate, that we're beginning to work out ways of measuring things. We're beginning to work out how we can measure risk. We're beginning to work out how we can measure progress. because it's a very important thing to be able to do. We need to be able to measure success so that we can report success. So then we have a better set of tools for making sure that we are directing our finance and our knowledge and our efforts towards the interventions that are giving the best results. I'm going to start wrapping up, because that's probably more than 2 minutes. And Benedita's question was, what would be my, I think the question was, what would be my recommendations for concrete action? And I think I would characterize my recommendations in 3 categories. Those categories would be financial, technical, and governance. And I think on the financial side, there are some clear priorities and some clear ways emerging from today's discussion for how we could see progress. I've talked already about the importance of strategic planning for improving the efficiency of how finance is mobilized for climate resilient infrastructure. I mentioned, I think, yesterday this idea that there's an ecosystem of different financial sources of finance out there. We have grants, we have climate finance mechanisms, we have bilateral donors, we have multilateral development banks that have a range of different mandates, some more concessional, some more commercial. And then we have private sources of finance, which is probably bigger than all of the others put together, if you can unlock it. And I think there's an important need to have better strategic planning at the country level to work out how national climate resilience and adaptation priorities can be translated into a framework for mobilizing finance and can be translated into a framework for planning investments. There are some great examples, for example, coming from the pilot program for climate resilience, which James Close talked about earlier, but it's not the only example. There are NAPs, there are other processes that we know about. It's clearly something that we can do, but greater action, I think, would be very valuable for mobilizing finance. I think also we've seen that from the discussions that climate resilience is often something which is systemic. It's something that's embedded into the whole way that we build infrastructure, the way that we scope it, the way that we design it, the way that we build it, the way that we manage it, the way that the institutions responsible for infrastructure are set up and organized, and the kinds of technical skills that they have. And I think this is something that is challenging a little bit the idea of incremental cost that we've all used for many, many years, and which has been very important for getting us to where we are now. But I think that as we get a deeper understanding of what climate resilience is and what it means for the whole life cycle of infrastructure assets, it's important to start thinking about how you do this systemically. And instead of thinking about adaptation as a little extra thing that you add on, how do you embed it into the whole process? On the technical side, I think clearly there's a huge need for skills transfer. And I think also the standards that we've discussed over the last few days. We've heard from the hydropower industry that there is emerging guidance coming from the hydropower industry on standards for climate resilience. We've heard from the ports industry that in the same way, there's guidance emerging from the ports industry on how to make port assets more resilient. And so we're beginning to see this groundswell of emerging standards for climate resilience. I think there's a really big question as to how emerging economies and developing countries can be made able to benefit from that kind of work. And that, I think, raises a big question about technical cooperation, technical assistance for making sure that emerging economies, where an awful lot of infrastructure is being built and will be built in the near future, to make sure that emerging economies and developing countries can benefit from these emerging standards. And that, I think, there's a real responsibility for MDBs and other development partners to be thinking about that, how we can act as the channels so that emerging economies can benefit from emerging best international practices. And my last point is that I think the third concrete recommendation is around governance. I think there's a really big governance gap when it comes to climate resilience in many, many countries around the world, including developed countries. And I think that's somewhere where concrete action could be extremely effective. I think it speaks to the point about strategic planning that I mentioned earlier. How, for example, could, say, an NDC evolve into a strategic planning framework for mobilizing finance for climate resilience? What would governments need to do? How would they need to organize themselves I think, again, James Close's presentation earlier touched on lots of those points. I think also there's another aspect to governance, which is maybe stepping slightly away from the government role in governance, but thinking about what kind of governance frameworks could mobilize much greater private action on climate resilience. And we've heard some really great examples from Jessica Williams from Standard & Poor's talking about the Task Force on Climate Risk Disclosure, which is a very interesting step forward in terms of the beginnings of a governance framework for financial institutions, in terms of how they disclose climate risks, and then how that might change their behavior and the behavior of their clients. So I think there are a number of important governance developments, and again, I come back to my point that in the light of the Paris Agreement, in the light of NDCs, I think it's a very exciting moment to be thinking about how development partners can support governments in developing the sorts of governance frameworks that could lead to better climate resilience outcomes and also greater volumes of finance mobilized for climate resilience. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have good news for you, Craig. We have been doing this for decades. Our interaction with World Business Council of Sustainable Development has been very constant, but this has opened new ways for us. And the previous SCF, for instance, opened our eyes to the whole world of forest financing, which many of us didn't know, and also insurance. So this has provided the SCF provided the opportunities for us to be more informed and to open a dialogue for infrastructure. This is, of course, very good. I think your conclusion about human development is very important. Matrices are going to be there as well.